The morning I finally understood what had been keeping me there, I was standing at the cedar stump in the grey light, before full dawn, holding a 5-pound canvas bag of sunflower seed, and I was not alone. I want to be careful about how I say this, because I have spent a long time choosing words that are accurate, and the situation does not offer easy, accurate words. I will only tell you what I saw, what I know, and what changed. I have told this story once before to a man named Roy Hatch, who used to work the route with me on heavy mail days, and Roy listened the whole way through without interrupting, and when I finished, he said, "Well, Earl." That was all he said. I understood him completely. To explain what I was doing at that stump in February, I need to go back to August, which is when I had decided to leave. Norma died in September of the year before, on a Tuesday. In the upstairs room she had always called the quiet room because the window faced east and the morning light came in clean. 11 months later I was still in the house, and I could not tell you why, except that leaving felt like a second thing I was not ready to do. The two of us had lived on those 12 acres for 26 years. We had been married 41 years altogether, which means I knew her in other houses and other towns, but those 12 acres were the ones that had shaped into a life. The ridge ran north behind the property, and the woodline came down close on the east and west, and on winter mornings you could stand on the porch and hear nothing but the creek and the chickadees, which Norma had considered one of the great under-publicized facts about western Pennsylvania. I had been a rural mail carrier for 31 years on the same route, out of the same post office, which meant I had driven the same roads in every kind of light and weather, and I knew when something was out of place. That sounds like a small credential. It wasn't. When you have driven a road in hard frost and in mud season and in August heat for 3 decades, you notice things. The dead elm that leans a few degrees further every winter. The way the Yarnell dogs stop barking at the truck after about 8 years and start just watching. The difference between a deer track in soft mud and anything that isn't a deer track. I am telling you this up front because what I am about to describe is the account of a man who, by professional habit and long practice, does not see things that are not there. By August, I had decided the house needed to go. I had called a woman named Patsy Drummond at the county realty office, and she had driven up the ridge road and walked the 12 acres, and said she thought it would move quickly in the fall. Small acreage like that with good timber, and a creek on the east boundary. I told her October. She wrote that down. The boxes I started packing were the easy ones first. Books mostly. Some of Norma's teaching things, the laminated charts and the rolled-up maps she had used for 30 years, in a 4th-grade classroom 20 minutes down the valley. I put those in a box, and I taped it, and I set it by the door. And then I stood in the hallway for a while and went back to the kitchen and sat down at the table and did not do anything for a long time. The kitchen was the hardest room, not because of anything dramatic, because it was too large. I don't mean it was physically large. It was an ordinary farmhouse kitchen with an 8-foot ceiling and an old cast-iron wood stove against the north wall, and a table for 4 that I had never once used all 4 chairs at, even when Norma was alive, because it was just the two of us. After she was gone, I stopped putting 2 cups on the counter in the mornings. I stopped that in about the 3rd week, but I kept making enough coffee for 2 people for another 3 months before I noticed I was doing it, and stopped. Small machinery runs a long time after you cut the power. Clover was 11 years old by then, which is old for a beagle, and she had the particular dignity of a dog who has stopped needing to prove anything. Her hips gave her trouble going down the porch steps, but she managed. She had been Norma's dog first, in the way that animals in a shared house sometimes choose, and after Norma was gone, she stayed close to me in a way she had never quite done before, which I took as her own version of adjustment. She slept at the foot of the bed. She followed me from room to room without making it conspicuous. She was old and arthritic and matter-of-fact about everything, and I found that a reasonable comfort. Norma had started the bird-feeding ritual at the cedar stump about 10 years before she died. The stump was old when we moved in, about 30 feet from the east edge of the yard, where the grass gave way to a mat of pine needles, and then the tree line proper began. She had started setting seed there in the winters because she said the feeder pole was too exposed for the shyer birds, the ones that didn't want to be in the open. The cedar stump sat in partial shadow at the edge of things, and the juncos and the nuthatches and the tufted titmice came to it steadily all winter long. She had a particular interest in the juncos. She called them her winter birds. Every morning from October through March, she would carry a 5-pound canvas bag of black oil sunflower seed out to that stump and fill the shallow depression in the top of it, the one that had formed over years of weather. And she would stand there for a few minutes watching who came, and then she would come back in. I kept doing it after she was gone. I didn't decide to. I just kept doing it. The canvas bag hung on the hook by the back door where she had always kept it, and each morning I filled it from the 50-pound sack of sunflower seed I kept in the shed, and I carried it out and filled the stump, and I stood there for the same few minutes watching who came. Sometimes nobody came while I was standing there. That was fine. The juncos usually arrived while I was walking back to the house. I watched them from the kitchen window most mornings, small, dark shapes moving around the stump, and I thought about Norma. I want to be precise about this. I was not doing well. I was functional, which is different. I paid what needed paying. I drove down the ridge road for groceries and for the occasional hardware item. I kept the wood stove fed and the pipes from freezing, and Clover's arthritis medication filled at the vet clinic in town. I called my son Dale twice in that first month after Norma died, and we had conversations that were careful in the way that conversations are careful when the people having them do not know what to say and are both aware they do not know what to say. After those 2 calls, there was silence, and the silence settled, and by the time August came around, it had been 19 months since I had talked to Dale at all. I am not laying blame for that. It takes 2 people to make a silence that long. Patsy Drummond called again in late September to ask if I wanted to go on the market. I told her I needed another few weeks. She was pleasant about it and said to call whenever I was ready. I hung up and looked at the boxes by the door, and then I looked out the window at the cedar stump, which still had a little seed in the depression from that morning's fill. I didn't call her back in October. I meant to. The weeks moved through me the way weeks do when the structure of a life has come loose from its moorings, and October became November, and I was still on the ridge with the boxes by the door, and Clover sleeping at the foot of the bed and the stump getting its seed every morning regardless. If you've ever waited for something you couldn't name, you might understand what those autumn weeks felt like. I wouldn't say I was waiting. I wouldn't say I knew anything was coming. I would say that something in the ordinary shape of my days had begun to feel slightly provisional, the way a cleared table feels before someone has decided what to put on it. The first thing I noticed was in November, and I would have dismissed it entirely, except that I knew my own property the way I knew the mail route, which is to say by the small variations that signaled change. What I noticed was that Clover, who had not shown real interest in the east tree line in at least 2 years, started sitting at the edge of the porch and looking toward it in the late afternoons. She didn't bark, she didn't growl. She just looked, with the particular focused quality of a dog who has scented something worth attending to. Her ears moved, but the rest of her stayed still. I looked too. I saw the tree line. I told myself it was probably deer. We had decent deer pressure on the property in November, and Clover had tracked deer in her younger years, and even a dog who is retired from the work sometimes recognizes the smell. I watched the east tree line for a few minutes each time she did this, and saw nothing. I let it sit at that. December was cold that year, the particular dry Pennsylvania cold that settles into the ridges by the second week of the month and does not move again until March. I was burning through cordwood faster than I liked, which meant I spent a portion of every clear day splitting at the woodpile behind the house. I had a Scandinavian pattern maul that Norma had given me 20 years earlier, because she said the one I had was a danger to myself and others, which was probably fair, and I had used that maul until the hickory handle had worn to a gloss in the grip spots. Working the woodpile was the part of winter I minded least. It was clear and physical, and the result was visible and warm. The third morning of December, I went out to fill the cedar stump and found the seed arranged differently than I had left it. I want to be careful here because I know how that sounds, and I'm going to tell you what I actually saw rather than what it might suggest. The stump's depression holds about 1.5 cups of sunflower seed when filled properly, and I had filled it the morning before. What I found the next morning was that the seed had been moved to one side, the south side, in a way that left the center of the depression clear. And in the center, placed with a flatness and an evenness that ruled out the wind, was a single piece of grey-white birch bark, roughly the size of my palm, with 3 smooth creek stones on top of it, each one small enough to fit in a closed fist. I stood there for a long moment. My first thought was a child from somewhere nearby, some kid who had wandered up the ridge road and through the property, which 12-year-old kids in rural Pennsylvania have been doing for as long as there have been ridges. I checked the pine needle mat around the stump for small boot prints. I found nothing clear enough to be certain, but nothing that looked like a child's boot. I also noted that the nearest neighbouring property was the Kettner farm, which was 3/4 of a mile down the road, and that their youngest was 16 and, as far as I knew, not in the habit of walking ridge roads at dawn, arranging stones on stumps. My second thought was a raccoon, but I have watched raccoons around that stump for 10 winters, and what they do is scatter. They don't arrange. A raccoon in a bird feeder creates entropy, not order. The stones were placed with a deliberateness that raccoons do not possess. I took the bark and the stones inside and set them on the kitchen windowsill. I didn't know why. It seemed like the right response to something I couldn't categorize. Clover had been with me at the stump that morning. She had sniffed around the base of it with more thoroughness than usual, circling it twice, nose working. Then she had sat down and looked toward the east tree line and thumped her tail once against the ground, the way she did when she was satisfied rather than alarmed. I noted that too. January was when I first saw something I couldn't explain away with a tired category. It was late afternoon, the sky doing that specific thing Pennsylvania winter skies do at around 4:30, going from pale grey to a dim amber in the low places between the ridges, while the high places go darker faster. I was coming back from the woodpile with an armload of split red oak, crossing the east yard toward the back door, when I saw movement at the tree line. Not the small, flickering movement of a bird or a squirrel, something larger. The kind of movement that your body registers before your mind catches up. The way you notice the size of a thing before you notice any detail of it. I stopped walking. Whatever it was at the edge of the timber, probably 40 yards from where I stood, and it was partially behind 2 large hemlocks. I could see a vertical shape that was darker than the bark of the trees around it, and I could see that this shape was tall. Taller than the hemlock's first heavy branches, which began at around 8 feet from the ground. It was not moving. It had been moving, and then it had stopped. I stood there with the red oak against my chest and looked at it for what I would estimate at 40 seconds. which is a long time to stand still in 20-degree air with your arms full. My first explanation was a black bear. We have black bear on that ridge and I have seen them close. The problem was the shape. Bears at the tree line are horizontal in the way that large quadrupeds are horizontal, low-slung even when they stand up on their hind legs, which they don't do long. This shape was vertical in the way that a standing thing is vertical, and it had the proportions of a standing thing rather than a rearing thing, the width distributed differently than a bear's width. I stood and looked, and the shape did not move. And then the light dropped another degree and the shape was just the tree line. I went inside. I set the wood down by the stove. I told myself bear again, and I was less certain than I had been the first time I told myself that. 3 days later, I went back out to the woodpile in the same late afternoon window and stood where I had stood and looked at those 2 hemlocks for a while. The distance from where I stood to the base of the larger hemlock was 42 steps. I walked it. I told myself I was checking for bear sign, which was technically true. I found no bear sign. I did find in the soft earth between the hemlock's roots, where the soil was partially sheltered from the frost, a depression that I knelt beside for a considerable time. It was not a bear track. It was not a deer track. I have 20 years of field experience with Pennsylvania wildlife sign, not as a hunter, just as a man who has watched his 12 acres closely. And what I found between those roots was not made by any animal I could name from personal observation. It was large, larger than my boot by a margin that required me to measure it against my boot 3 times before I trusted the measurement. I went back inside. I sat at the kitchen table with the 3 smooth creek stones from the stump on the windowsill in front of me. I had a conversation with myself that lasted approximately 20 minutes, involving all the reasonable explanations I could assemble, and at the end of it I was left with what I had actually seen and actually measured, and the reasonable explanations were not comfortably covering it. That was January. I did not call Patsy Drummond. I did not pack any more boxes. I started going out to the cedar stump in the mornings with a slightly different quality of attention than I had brought to it in November and December. February in Pennsylvania is the month that grinds. The cold by then is not crisp and clear, it is just relentless, and the cordwood stack that looked adequate in December starts to look like a calculation you got wrong. I was burning 2 or 3 good splits of red oak an hour to keep the house livable, and I had enough wood to last into March if I was careful. I split a little more each clear day. I kept the canvas bag on the hook by the back door and filled the stump every morning, and Clover and I stood there for a few minutes each time, her nose working, her tail moving in its slow, satisfied way. And we went back inside. I began to notice that the seed I put out in the evenings, on the 2 or 3 days a week, I would add a small top-off to the stump, was more disturbed in the morning than what I left in the morning top-off. Not scattered. Moved, the way the December arrangement had been moved. Pushed gently to the edges. I also noticed twice that small branches had been laid against the base of the stump, not fallen branches, but branches that had been broken off at a height I could not replicate without standing on something, given that the nearest trees were saplings. I want to be honest about my state of mind in this period. I was not frightened. That seems like an odd thing to say, given what I am describing, but it is accurate. I was attentive in the way you are attentive when something large and unfamiliar is operating in close proximity, but the quality of the thing did not feel threatening. Clover, who would have been clear about a threat, who was old but who still had the beagle's bone-level instinct about what warranted alarm, was calm. I trusted Clover's read on the situation considerably more than I trusted my own by that point. The last week of February, I woke up earlier than usual. I don't know what woke me. I lay in the dark for a minute, Clover breathing at the foot of the bed, and the house was quiet in its usual way except that I was awake. I got up, dressed in the dark, and went downstairs without putting the light on. I don't do things without reason, as a general matter. I am not a person who acts on impulse or intuition, and I want to be clear about that, because what I'm about to tell you sounds like the kind of thing a person acts on impulse to do. What I knew, standing in the dark kitchen at around 5 in the morning, was that something had been coming to the cedar stump, and that it had been doing so in the dark or the near dark, and that whatever it was had given me no reason in 6 weeks of evidence to be afraid of it. I took my coat from the hook, and then I took the canvas bag from the hook beside it, and I filled it in the dark from the shed, and I went out to the stump in the dark. The cold was the dry, hard cold of late February. The kind that sounds different than ordinary cold, quieter and sharper at the same time. There was no wind, there was no moon to speak of, but there was enough pale light coming off the snow on the north side of the yard that I could see reasonably. I walked to the cedar stump, 30 feet from the tree line, and I poured the seed into the depression, and I stood there. Clover was behind me. She had followed me out without my noticing, which was a thing she could still do, old as she was, when she decided to bother. She came to stand beside my left boot, her side against my leg, and she was looking at the tree line, and her tail was moving in that slow, easy way. I don't know how long I stood there before I knew something was at the tree line. It was not a sound. It was the absence of sound, which, on a ridgeline in February at 5 in the morning, you would think was unremarkable because it is always quiet. But this was a different quality of quiet, the kind that your body knows without your mind's help, the stillness that a large thing casts around it when it has been standing still long enough. I have felt it once before in my life, standing beside a bull moose on the edge of a clearing in Ontario, 20 years ago, before the moose decided I was not interesting. The air gets its character changed by a large animal at rest. I looked toward the east tree line, and I could see, between the 2 hemlocks I had been watching since January, a shape, darker than the dark around it. Still. I have thought for months about how to describe the next few minutes, and I have not improved on simple description. The shape was large, 8 or 9 feet, based on its relationship to the hemlocks which I had measured. It was not moving. It was standing with the specific quality of something that has been standing for a long time and is comfortable standing for longer. It did not feel like a waiting predator, and I have been around enough of those, in small versions, to know the quality of that energy. It felt like something present. After a time I cannot accurately measure. The shape moved. It moved toward the stump. Not fast, not sudden. The way something large and deliberate moves when it has no reason to hurry, each step placed with a care that was itself a statement of intention. I did not move. Clover did not move. She was pressing her side gently against my boot, and her tail was still moving its slow arc, and I looked down at her once, for the reassurance, and she was watching the shape come toward us with something that looked, in the half-dark, like ordinary interest. It came to about 15 feet from the stump, and then it slowed further and stopped, and I could see it more clearly than I had seen it at the tree line, though clearly is not the right word for 5 in the morning in February, with no moon. I could see that it was very large and that it was covered in dark fur or hair, and that it stood upright in the way that I had noticed from across the yard in January, with the proportions of a thing that stands rather than a thing that stands up. I could see the outline of its shoulders, which were broad in a way that had no reference in my experience, and I could see its face, in the way you see a face in low light, without detail, just the shape and the quality of it, which was turned toward me. I thought I should be afraid. I was not afraid. I don't know how to account for that, except to say that Clover had made her read and I had made mine. And the read was that nothing in this moment intended any harm to me or to my 11-year-old beagle or to the 12 acres we were standing on. What happened next, I will tell you as plainly as I can. The creature reached into the depression in the cedar stump, the one that Norma had been filling for 10 winters before me, and with a gentleness that was almost delicate for something of that size, it arranged the seed. Not scattered it, arranged it, pushed it into a careful ring around the edge of the depression, the way you would make a wreath of it. The center left clear the way Norma had sometimes left the center, clear on mornings when the juncos were feeding heavily from the edges, and she didn't want to disturb the pattern they'd found. And then it set something in the center. I did not move while it was doing this. I could not have moved. It set a junco feather in the center of the seed. A single, small, dark feather, the kind the juncos left behind all winter in the pine needle mat under the trees, dark grey with the faint white edge, the kind Norma had sometimes picked up and kept on the kitchen sill with other small things she noticed. I stood at the cedar stump in the dark in February, with my boots on the frozen ground and my old beagle at my heel, and something loosened in my chest that had been pulled tight for 11 months, and I did not make a sound. The creature stood there for another moment. It looked at the feather. Then it looked at me. What I felt in that look, I am not going to try to name because any name I put on it will be smaller than what it was. I will say that it felt like being seen by something that had been watching long enough to understand what it was watching. That is the most accurate I can be. Then it turned and walked back to the tree line with the same unhurried deliberateness, and the hemlocks closed around it, and it was gone. I stood at the stump until the sky had gone from black to that particular deep blue that comes about 20 minutes before true dawn. Clover stood beside me the whole time. Eventually I crouched down, which my knees reminded me I'm no longer young enough to do on frozen ground without consequence, and I looked at the seed arranged in its careful ring and the single junco feather in the center. I didn't touch it. I went inside and sat at the kitchen table in my coat for a while. I looked at the 3 smooth creek stones on the windowsill, the ones from December. I looked at the birch bark they had been sitting on. I thought about Norma carrying the canvas bag out to that stump every morning for 10 winters, and about the juncos she called her winter birds, and about the way she sometimes stood there in the cold for longer than was practical because she was watching something she found beautiful and could not see any reason to hurry away from. I don't have a word for what I carried back into the house with me. I have been looking for one since February. The first thing I did that was different from what I had been doing was I went to the telephone on the 3rd of March. I had not called Dale in 19 months. That number is accurate and I'm not comfortable with it. But I'm going to be honest about it, the way I have tried to be honest about everything else in this account. 19 months. The silence had not come from anger, not exactly. It had come from the particular paralysis of not knowing what to say, and from the shame of knowing the silence had gone on long enough that the call itself would require acknowledgement, and from the calculus that runs in the back of a man's head that says, maybe tomorrow will be easier than today, which it never is. I called Dale's number at 7 in the morning on a Tuesday and got his voicemail, which I had expected. I listened to his recorded voice say his name, which is the voice of a man who sounds more like his mother every year, and I waited for the tone. I said, "Dale, it's your dad. I know it's been a while. I'm still on the ridge. The house is staying off the market. I just wanted to, I don't know." I was quiet for a second. "I just thought you should know I'm staying." I hung up. I stood by the phone for a minute, not waiting for it to ring, just standing there. Then I went and found one of the boxes I had packed in August, the one with Norma's rolled-up classroom maps and her laminated charts, and I cut the tape and opened it, and I took the maps out and set them on the kitchen table. The house did not go back on the market. I told Patsy Drummond I had reconsidered, and she was gracious about it in the way that good real estate agents are gracious, because in rural Pennsylvania, small acreage moves slowly anyway, and she had not yet invested heavily in the listing. I thanked her, and she said any time, and that was that. I put Norma's maps in the closet upstairs where she had always kept them after she retired. The teaching charts I left on the table for a few days, because they were cheerful things, bright primary colors, the kind of teaching materials that assume the world is fundamentally legible and worth explaining to children. After a few days, I stacked them and put them on the shelf in the spare room. Not in a box, on the shelf. Dale called back on a Saturday, 10 days after my voicemail. I was in the woodshed when the phone rang, and by the time I got in the house, it had stopped. He had left a message. It was short. He said, "Dad, okay, I'm glad you're staying." There was a pause in the middle of it, the way there is a pause when someone has more to say and hasn't decided yet whether to say it. Then he said, "Maybe I'll come up in the spring, if that's all right." I played the message twice. Then I went back out to the woodshed because I had work to finish, and I finished it, and when I came in, I put the kettle on the stove. That is the practical account of what changed. A phone call made after 19 months of silence. One box unpacked. The house held for another season. Those are small things on paper, and they were not small things in practice. And I will leave you to understand why, without me explaining it further. The Junco feather is still on the cedar stump's depression. I don't move it when I fill the seed, just work around it. It has been out there through 3 weeks of weather now, and the birds don't disturb it, which I cannot account for practically, but which I have stopped trying to account for. There is a range of things I have stopped trying to account for. I have thought about what was at my stump in February, and I have not reached a conclusion I would stake anything on. I know what it was not. It was not a bear, and it was not a person, and it was not anything in the category of animal I have observed in 31 years on a western Pennsylvania rural route. Beyond that, I am not going to speculate, because speculation is not what I do with incomplete data, and the data is incomplete by definition. What I will tell you is that, whatever it was, it came to that stump for weeks before I saw it clearly, and it arranged things, and it watched, and it understood something about what that stump meant in a way that I would not have predicted anything was capable of understanding. Whether it understood it the way I understand things, whether understanding is even the right word for whatever it was doing, I genuinely do not know. What it did at the stump that morning was precisely matched to what Norma had done at that stump for a decade. And the matching was so specific, down to the way the center was left open and the feather placed there, that I am left with the plain statement that it had been paying attention for a long time. I am not a person who has many experiences he cannot explain. I have had exactly one, and this is it. I was a mail carrier for 31 years. And before that, I was a kid who grew up in this county and knew these ridges. And I have been on these 12 acres for 26 years, with a woman who fed the Juncos every winter morning like it mattered, which it did. And I have tried to keep doing it because the act itself was worth doing, and because she is gone and the stump is still there and the Juncos still come. I stayed on the ridge. That is the short version. I meant to leave in October and I left in March, which means I did not leave at all. And what made the difference was not a resolution or a decision, but a February morning at a cedar stump when something I will never be able to name did something I will never be able to explain. and it was kind. If something about that sits with you, there's another story on the screen when this one ends. I'd be glad for the company. It was March when I stopped making plans to leave, and April was coming, and the ridge does a particular thing in April that I had forgotten about, after a winter of not looking forward. And Clover was on the porch step in the weak, early sun with her nose pointed at the east tree line the way she had been doing since November, and the juncos were at the stump, and I stood in the back doorway with a cup of coffee and watched the yard for a while. The world does not owe anyone its attention. When it arrives, you do not waste time asking where it came from.